I'll start with declaring that I've always been skeptical of the legitimacy of paranormal stories. In summer of 2016, my wife and I welcomed our daughter to the world. We come from a tight-knit family, so of course we made plenty of time for all of our immediate family to spend time with the baby. Most notably was the time we spent with my grandmother, Susan. She was head over heels in love with her new great-granddaughter. We saw her nearly every weekend, if only just for a short time. Let's fast forward to the new year, January 2017. My mom rings early one morning and informs me that my grandmother has passed in the night, rather unexpectedly. It turns out that her cancer had returned, and she chose to refuse treatment and write it out without telling anyone. At this point, my daughter is only 5 months old. Jump ahead a couple of years now to my daughter at age 4. It's a quiet afternoon at my home. My wife and I are straightening up a bit while my daughter plays with her dolls. Out of nowhere, she starts laughing hysterically and blurts out, "I love you too." I turned around to look at her and I very briefly see something surrounding her for a split second. Not a dark spot, but a distortion of some sort, and it immediately leaves, like dust blowing in the wind. I asked my little girl who she's saying I love you to, and she says, "I was playing with Grandma Susan." I just about choked. She was barely 5 months old when my grandma passed. There's no way she remembers her, let alone her name. We have occasionally mentioned her here and there, but my daughter wouldn't form any recollection of her memory. My grandma, bless her soul, would always without fail say "I love you" when we were leaving. I was freaked out and delighted all at once. Fast forward again, 2022. My son, born 2018, is flipping through an old photo album with me one day. We come across some old photos of me as a young child playing in my parents' backyard. He stops, looks at one of the pictures and says, "Dada, that's Grandma Susan." He's never met her. Recounting my daughter's experience a few years prior, I just burst into tears and said, "Yeah, buddy, it sure is." There's not a fraction of doubt in me that my grandmother occasionally visits my kids, and I'm 100% okay with that, and thankful for it. I'm not sure what awaits us after we pass, but I'm pretty convinced our souls live on. I love you, Grandma. Please don't be a stranger. I miss you so dang much. I don't really know what to make of this, and I never really have. I live alone and spend many nights up late working on projects revolving around my photography. I run a side gig that involves photo shoots and editing, and I often lose track of time in the stillness of the night. Being a night owl by nature, this routine works for my schedule and allows my focus and creativity to flourish. I keep my workspace dimly lit, basking solely in the warm and gentle glow from the lamp in my study. Despite the late hour and my solitude, I've never once experienced an eerie or paranoid feeling. I consider myself fortunate to reside in an area I love, a quiet and safe neighborhood where the community is close-knit. I was sitting at my desk one night when out of nowhere, I felt a sense of dread, a strange, looming anxiety that became very noticeable within seconds. I stopped my work for a moment, figuring maybe stress finally caught up with me after a long week. I got up to grab water and stretch my legs that very much started to ache. When I get deeply involved in my work, I forget to take breaks. When I returned to my desk, I only got a little bit more work done when I finally told myself I should probably just call it a night. My head felt heavy and my mind was starting to stray from its normal, comforted space. I saved my work, shut off my PC, and walked across the study to turn off my lamp just like always. Here's what gets me. I'm a person of routine, and never once, out of all my late nights up working, have I ever had something like this occur. That night when I turned off my lamp, I turned around to walk to my bedroom and saw a large black mass glide at me at an alarming speed. like the ideal definition of a jump scare. It happened so quickly I instinctively ducked, almost falling to my knees as I expected something to make impact with me. My heart flopped in my chest as adrenaline started to flood my veins. Needless to say, I turned on my lamp again, and then practically every other light in the house. It took me a good while to shake the unease and a weird feeling that I needed to hide. I felt ridiculous. To this day, I still can't make any sense out of it, and even though it happened almost a year ago now, I can recall it as if it happened just yesterday. I've tried to rationalize it maybe being my eyes adjusting, a trick of the light, but the way it seemed to move toward me makes me think otherwise. Since then, I've spent many more late nights up in my study, but I've never had an experience like that again. And let me just say, even with me telling this story, I am not trying to welcome that experience back. To understand why my mother and I were out at Whitlock Lake, I have to give you a little background. My mother and I run a wreath business in a quiet northern Michigan town. Violent crimes are virtually non-existent. It was fall. Around this time of year, the forests in Michigan become rich with color. This day was full of warmth and vibrant hues. Instead of buying pine cones for decorating wreaths, we decided to go foraging for them in our local woods. I knew about Whitlock Lake from my high school days. Some of my friends and I went out there a couple times to party. It's a small camping area with about 3 sites. This lake is connected to another bigger lake a few miles down the road. It lies in a small old lodging town called Jennings, population 20, maybe a little less or more. The times I went out there as a high school student, it never really had a strange feeling in the air. But the day my mother and I went to forage, the air was thick with fear, and we felt like we were being watched. We thought maybe it was just woodland creatures hiding and watching, just waiting for us to leave. We continued on. About an hour goes by and we decided to move where the forest meets the water. There are cute little baby pine cones found there, ones we used for our tabletop wreaths. Shortly after, we found ourselves at the edge of the lake where we heard a few gunshots from across. We live in northern Michigan. People are getting ready for hunting season around this time of year, so we shrugged it off. We got into our car and moved down the trail. When we got out, I noticed quite a few shotgun shells on the ground. Again, it's not uncommon to find shells of any sort on the ground this time of year. So again, we continued. We were at the end of the trail with the last 2 campsites on either side. We continued foraging for about 20 more minutes when we walked across the trail to the next side. That's when we noticed something very strange. At the opening of the campsite, we noticed a tall 5 or 6 foot wooden pole. On top of that pole, we saw 2 leather straps wafting in the wind. To us, that was strange. Why would someone want leather straps on top of a pole? Of course, we put that out of our minds for the time being and continued. But a short while later, we stumbled upon an old beat-up mattress that looked like it had been there for quite a while. As we got closer to it, the ground around was very mucky. As soon as you stepped somewhere, you just about sunk half a foot down. Unfortunately, people dump garbage in the woods a lot up here. When we started walking past it to get to the pine cones on the other side, this horrible smell seeped into our nostrils. We both looked at each other at the same time and scrambled our way out of there. By that time, we were scared out of our wits. As we were driving out of the trailhead, we were met by a guy in a red Cadillac. The look on his face unsettled us greatly. Maybe it was a coincidence, maybe it was all in our heads. I would like to think that my mother and I have a good sense for that sort of thing, and we got out of there just in the nick of time. Needless to say, my mother and I have never been back to that lake. and don't plan on going back. About a week later, I couldn't hold this event inside anymore, so I called the cops and recalled the incident as best as I could. They said they would look into it, but I haven't heard anything back since. This trip still haunts me to this day. I'm always thinking about what may have actually happened out there. I'm a 26-year-old female who's about 5'0" and generally harmless looking. I have no idea what it is about being seemingly harmless, but it tends to attract a whole array of bad news. Don't believe me? Go ask a soft-spoken, tiny girl who gives you the first impression of, isn't she just adorable? And more than likely, she'll have enough stories to make you worry about your sanity. This is compounded by my overall attitude of, I'll be sugar, rainbows, and sunshine right up until you give me a reason not to. A job in retail makes the whole mess about as fun as bamboo splinters under your fingernails. Whoever came up with the idea the customer is always right needs to be crushed, brought back, and then crushed again. That said, I'll still do anything within the limits of my job for a customer. I like helping customers out. I work as an overnight supervisor into a 24-hour drugstore. We get plenty of creepy people in, being a fair-sized city with only 2 24-hour pharmacies in town. I have some really weird stories. The evening of this incident in particular had me working on a Saturday night with 2 other front-end employees. Saturday nights mean ad tags. We overnighters, the few, the lucky, are the ones stuck with this joyful job. It means 10 hours of monotony and a lot of back and forth around the store. Usually the nights pass with some regulars, drunks, and the occasional sick person or the person with the sick loved one at home. Most intoxicated persons are in and out like a flash, but I've noticed the more out of their wits they are, the higher the potential for creepy is. So you learn to watch the ones with strange body language. It was about 1:30 a.m. when this taller, wiry man walked into my store. His dark brown hair was cropped pretty short, and he was dressed fairly casual. I didn't even realize his presence in the store until the cashier for the night, Daniel, came up to me and muttered something about the weird guy wandering around the front of the store. Daniel is middle-aged, but mischievous and irritable are 2 descriptions of him. You never quite know when he's just stirring the pot, so I searched this guy down to see how he was bothering him. I had been thinking it was more than likely he'd noticed something strange about the guy and might be worried about shoplifting. I found the man in question pacing along the front wall, so I approached him and asked if he needed any help in my cheeriest customer service voice. The moment he turned around, I froze. This man radiated violence. It surrounded him like an aura of menace. I couldn't pinpoint what was bothering me. The weirdly still expression, maybe? Or the way he was standing. He was unnaturally tense during my whole experience with him, like he was ready to go off at the first opportunity. Truthfully, I still haven't quite figured that out, but he was just off. At least enough to send up red flags just looking at him. Immediately uncomfortable, I was all too happy when he muttered, "No, I'm, just looking." I've never figured out how to gracefully exit the situation when a customer has nothing left to say, but they still stand there, staring, which almost feels expectant, even if it's not. After a minute or so of avoiding meeting his eyes, I told him my usual line of, "All right, well, let us know if you need anything." I backed into the aisle I'd emerged from and hurried off to busy myself with more ad tags. Daniel could keep an eye on him if he felt like it. The guy was scary and I was the only female on shift. They don't pay me enough to get involved with stuff like that. It's not long before I start to feel like I'm being watched, and creepy suspect number 1 is lurking at the top of the aisle, staring. I finish all of the tags in line for that aisle and I'm relieved when I have to move across the store for others in a different section. A few moments pass, and that weird prickly feeling hits me. And again, there he is, at the end of the aisle, staring right at me. I ask for the second time if I can help him find anything, and he pretends to busy himself with some vitamins he randomly picked up. He gave me a very uneasy grin and told me again that he was just looking. Yeah, sure, I bet you were. I thought to myself. This continues for another half hour or so, until I find myself heading up to the front to ring up a customer. I had no idea where Daniel was, but at that time it didn't matter. I was grateful for the distraction. That was, until I noticed him following me up to the register, still staring. I conducted the transaction as quickly as possible, and after a few too many nervous glances in his direction, the customer suddenly took off like someone had lit him on fire. I decided to go outside for my lunch break. I searched out one of my coworkers and let them know my intentions, clocked out and stepped outside and into my car. Now, normally I try to avoid smoking in my car. Have never liked the way it sticks, but desperate times call for desperate measures. I locked the car doors and rolled down the window, just far enough to fit my cigarette through to ash it. I picked up my book, turned to the page I'd left off on, and settled in. Only a few paragraphs in, I heard someone banging on my window. I jumped and looked up. Guess who? You should probably already know. He grinned at me in what I'm sure was supposed to be a sheepish fashion, but it came out more Norman Bates, if you know what I mean. I again asked if I could help him, and he said he'd been looking for something in particular that he'd like my help with. I told him firmly that there were 2 other employees in the store that would have to help him. I was off the clock. He frowned, and after a moment of me blatantly ignoring him, he went back inside. My lunch break ended, and I still hadn't seen him come back out. I hurried inside, clocked in, and called the other shift supervisor, Mark, into the office. I explained the situation and asked him if he could go deal with the guy. Mark sighed, nodded, and went to talk to him. I busied myself in the office with some training sessions I'd been putting off for a while. Mark came back inside the office wearing a very bewildered look. I raised an eyebrow and he sat down.
That guy is really weird.
Weird is not quite the adjective I'd use. What'd he say?
He wanted to talk to you again.
I told him you had other things you needed to be doing, but I'd be happy to help him. And for some reason that agitated him.
You thought he was alarming beforehand? Well,
Mark visibly shuddered and I squinted.
He asked me if I knew what time you got off, or where you lived.
Mark replied.
Exactly. I told him we were legally obligated not to share such information, and that if he wasn't going to go buy anything, he needed to leave. Then he left. I followed him out just in case. He was looking around your car until he noticed I did. Then he got in his car and drove off.
After all this happened, I decided I wasn't going to stick around to see if he was going to come back, and I opted out of the rest of my shift. Shortly after, my store set up a guard contract with the local police department. I haven't seen him since. I should mention that I previously lived in a tiny town, but went to high school in a considerably larger city. I never had a reason or the nerve to go out in the city on my own, so when my 2 friends wanted to hang out around town, I was nervous, to say the least. However, I eventually thought, what the heck, I'll go with them. We had a blast for a couple of hours after school, with some small, scary incidents along the way. Those being, walking through a store full of expensive statues and gemstones, with me having a massive backpack protruding from my back, and the original restaurant we wanted to go to being closed, which forced us to Subway. However, as it got dark, we all knew we had to go home, so we made time to squeeze in one last store before going our separate ways. As I waited outside the store, alone and in the dark, I strangely didn't feel all too afraid. Yet, I had told my mother where to find me, but she's sometimes hopeless with directions, so I had expected to be hanging around for at least a little while. I noticed a news camera stationed outside the store, which made me feel safer. About 10 minutes into the wait, I was approached by two men. My memory is fuzzy due to how anxious I was, but this is what I remember. One of them spoke up.
"Hey, do you know where this town is?"
I shook my head. I was already uneasy because I'm a paranoid person on even my best of days, and this was not turning out to be one of those.
"Aw, come on,"
one man coaxed.
"Listen, we'll give you a bag of jewelry if you help us,"
the other man said. Now I was genuinely becoming frightened. I glanced around, noticing the news camera as I stepped a little closer to its line of sight. Listen, I stammered, trying really hard not to stammer or show how scared I was. I think it's that way, and I don't need anything, I said, pointing in a random direction. They glanced in the direction of my finger, then glanced back.
"Can you show us? Again, we have a bag of jewelry."
It felt as if my heart leaped into my throat. No, thank you, my mom is coming to get me, I said as calmly as I could. They stared at me for a few seconds, then nodded, thanking me as I headed off in the direction I pointed. I kept well in the line of sight of the news camera until my mother picked me up. I wasn't able to fully relax again for a whole week. I have absolutely no idea why they were so eager to give me that bag of jewelry. My first thought was that they stole it and wanted to throw the police off their trail by handing it off to me. Unlikely. The second was that they were trying to lure me away with the jewelry. Either way, I knew it wouldn't have ended well for me if that was their goal. No one quite believed me, but I didn't expect them to, really. And because of it, I've never felt comfortable in the city alone, in the dark, ever since.